Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Beyond the Buzz, the Rise of LLMs and AI in Communication Surveillance. I'm David Aronson, Product Marketing at Shield, and I'll be your moderator for this intriguing and timely conversation. Before we dive in, I have to share something interesting I discovered about some of our panelists in one of our recent conversations together. Turns out we have not one, but two accomplished tennis players with us today, in Stan and Cameron. So you can expect them to serve up some important insights, and just like that, hundreds of people around the world just drop their faces straight into their hands. Now for a little bit of housekeeping, we have 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to add them in the chat. Someone from our team will be monitoring and compiling the questions for our speakers. If we run short on time to answer your question, we'll be sure to compile answers from the panelists after the event, and we'll reach out to you with an answer. Allow me to introduce our experts who will be leading today's discussion. Cameron Funkhouser is a former FINRA senior executive and an expert in financial services regulations and compliance. Cameron's experience and unique perspective on protecting the markets are invaluable. Stan Yakoff, our next panelist, is the head of supervision in the Americas at Citadel, an expert in financial services e-coms compliance, teaches law students on the subject as well. We look forward to Stan's insights into the practical aspects of AI and e-coms compliance. Last but not least, Dr. Shlomit Labin is Vice President of Data Science at Shield, holding 2 PhDs, and now has a very shiny Best Cloud Innovator of the Year award from the Cloud Awards. Congratulations on that, Shlomit. An expert in AI, data science, and the financial compliance market, Shlomit brings a wealth of knowledge and innovative thinking to our conversation. As we dive into the discussion, we hope to leave you with a new perspective and tools to understand and leverage the exciting developments in AI and compliance. So sit back, relax, maybe grab a tennis racket, and let's jump right in. So let's start with a softball. What makes large language models and ChatGPT so interesting to us from a compliance perspective? And I'm just going to throw this out.
Okay, so
Yeah,
maybe
you want to lead off?
go ahead.
Oh, so let me go ahead.
I cannot handle silences very well. Okay, so in general, when we're talking about large language models and the new generative AI, we're talking about real breakthroughs in the domain of text analysis or free language analysis. This is the main challenge in the compliance industries, being able to monitor human conversations. It has been a challenge for many years, and now we have the innovative tools to actually deal with it.
Okay, thanks, Shlomit. Stan, what you got?
Thanks, David. So before I begin, let me just give my quick legal disclaimer that the views expressed herein are solely those of my own, not any current or prior employer necessarily. So with that being said, what's interesting here, I think, is that for one of the very rare times we see convenience and compliance possibly hand in hand. So when you historically think about how technology has been developed, particularly in the compliance, regtech, fintech, name whatever acronym you want to give here, space, oftentimes you're going to need to have two PhDs like Shlomit, right, in 2 different domains, one in psychology, one in computer science, if I got that correctly, in order to even interact with the tooling. Here, all you have to do is really just go on the website, sign up, right, confirm via your email, and then you have access to very powerful technology. So like for the reason I say it's rare is oftentimes the tech gets built and then you have to figure out how in the world you're going to interact with it. Here, you actually have a very easy way of interacting with very powerful technology. So that's caused, I think, a lot of us and our much older family members to all of a sudden start interacting with robots more than we ever thought we would be.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, grandmothers and grandfathers everywhere are actually like going online and getting answers to all their questions, except why won't my Wi-Fi work? Because that still won't help you. Cameron, what do you think? What makes LLMs so
I've been around a pretty long time. I mean, in the early 90s, I was helping develop some what was considered revolutionary technology using artificial intelligence that, looking back on it, is laughable now because we were doing structured word analysis and connecting the dots. I mean, the potential from from there to here, you can imagine in your own minds what the difference is between AM radio and Netflix, right? I mean, there are lots and lots of opportunities, probably more opportunities than we could talk about today or even think about, but the opportunities to be more effective and more cost efficient and reduce your regulatory risk are enormous.
Thanks. So before we continue on, I just want to pose a quick anonymous poll from the crowd. So from one to five being most advanced, which is like, we knew about ChatGPT before it was cool. So how far along is your firm in implementing AI in your compliance strategy? I know we hear a lot of questions about it, a lot of ideas get kicked around, but really curious to hear. And I think the audience really would like to hear from each other, kind of like where everyone else is holding. We'll continue on while people still answer. Stan, let me pose this question to you. How far along is your team in your AI journey? And is it a 1? Is it a 5?
Yeah, so I generally don't put a number on this, but I'll talk about experience, right? And specifically my own here. So the way I look at it is I've employed certain like algorithmic techniques, as I'll call them right now, that function to essentially cluster trading activity, which gets an idea for like what typical or normal trading activity looks like, and analyzing activities that fall outside of these normal distributions over longer periods of time, like 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Because generally what I see is that the longer horizons tend to help reduce noise from just an atypical market day that could be characterized by like isolated news events, like, more recently interest rate bumps and such. And I think this technique helps illustrate where algorithms may be behaving anomalously, like for example, trading more than usual, and incorporate other important dimensions like P&L into this type of analysis, as well as like whether the trading activity may have triggered trading controls that cause rejects and stuff like that, which you generally don't want to see, or if an algorithm really behaves as it should be from the start, you really shouldn't be seeing this type of stuff. So once this occurs, right, from a detection point of view, the curiosity now goes on the investigation side, and you start to ask yourself, like, what may be the driver for the heightened activity, right? Once you isolate out expected factors like news and contract expiries, rollovers, like, again, things that you expect. And what's pretty cool is like you start to identify unusual market data movements that may resemble possible market abuse. And what's interesting is you see this externally in the market. Like, this isn't stuff that you have control over internally yourself, which really means is that the challenge is now you're a victim in what's going on, and it's much more challenging to control again, because again, this is happening in the market. So if you really think about what's going on, you essentially create a feedback loop between something that surveillance found, and really the only thing you could do is to try to be preventative from a front office / trading perspective, and to think about like, hey, how can we identify gaming ourselves and try not to interact with this type of activity once we see this pattern forming, right? So this has been pretty interesting, but I still consider this to be like experimental and really a supplement to, let's say, non-AI based algorithms, as opposed to some kind of outright substitution or replacement. And I'm going to talk about that aspect of like being very careful with the word substitution or replacement quite a lot here. So just giving that warning. Now, if we turn to like communication surveillance, right? I think this lens of supplement, like which I just gave that disclaimer for, and experimental is a really important one to analyze this domain through, because from a communications perspective, like where I personally see technology like GPT having the most value in the near term is where you help provide additional information rather than draw conclusions. So a good example from a technique perspective is like topic discovery, or essentially summary statements to assess quick themes from otherwise like very lengthy and I'm sure legally cleverly worded text. We've all been there, right? So visually, if you think about this, this is like akin to like a word cloud where certain words are emphasized in size and font, right? I think many of us have probably seen charts like this and found it quite helpful because the words jump out at you right away based on essentially their importance, right? Now, topic discovery has its own dimension, such as like who's the conversation with. For example, a client is different than a counterparty, than someone else internally from XYZ team in your firm. Secondly, like what is the tone of the conversation, right? So a complaint is very different than like angst or uncertainty over a choice versus like a very passionate debate on what are the most optimal lunch choices around me, right? And when I look at how regulators have thought about this topic too. Like, there's actually a speech from January 2017 from SEC's DERA office, the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, where they give an example of applying another technique called LDA, latent direct allocation, to SEC registrants' disclosures and filings, where they're looking for possible emerging trends. And like the example they give, like the study essentially was, now that you have hindsight bias, could you have predicted the rise of credit default swaps and the effect that it had in 2008, right? And what they saw is that in 1998, if I recall right, there's about 3 references by banks in their 10K filings. And then 6 years later, there's over 100 references. And then between 2007 and 2008, there's like a 10-fold increase. Right. So it's interesting from a topic discovery point of view, because now you're finding these emerging themes and, you know, words or phrases or possibly products you've never seen before that themselves carry their own risks. Right. So from that topic discovery point of view, I think that there's a natural segue into, well, what's the tone of a conversation, and applying like AI/NLP to provide observant assessments of emotional context rather than just the substantive context.
You know, Stan,
and
I think
lastly, I'll just say,
sorry.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple quick words on like the importance of proper governance, and then kind of hand over the mic on this, because I'm mindful that I introduced like several new applications or kind of experimental applications again, as I use that word. And I also want to caveat it with the really strong importance on control and governance. So all throughout, I've mentioned this is essentially applied on a supplemental basis, not a kind of replacement or essentially a conclusive and therefore consequential basis. So like having the technology and techniques be aids rather than conclusive without any oversight or supervision, right? And thus being consequential, like makes all the difference. And I know like we're going to talk later about the nuanced risks, but I wanted to kind of throw that careful balance and way of thinking about this earlier on.
Yeah, for sure.
I'll now hand over the mic back.
Fascinating. Thanks, Stan. I think it's fascinating, just like what you just described, being at still the experimental, you know, state, still like discovery of LLMs and what we can do with this technology today. That's impressive. And just reflecting back, just looking at the results from our poll, I mean, it looks like there's 9 people who are at, you know, 4 and 5. And then like 13 at 3, and that's really, I think a lot of people are still at 1 and 3. So it looks like people are still kind of figuring it out, and it makes sense, you know, kind of what you described as being in the experimental stage, why, you know, people are not necessarily going to call it a 5 yet, because it's going to take a while to get there. Cameron, now you've heard what Stan is doing. As a former FINRA regulator, what do you think? Are there any coverage issues there?
Well, I would start with, you know, from a regulatory standpoint, there's a baseline rules and regulations set that you have to comply with, right? So I don't think that regulators are too interested in who's experimenting with what technology as long as they get coverage. So that's the baseline, right? So when FINRA or the SEC or another regulator comes to call, and they're going to say, here's the rule set, how are you complying with the rules? Unfortunately, in my experience, and I should also caveat it by saying I don't speak for FINRA. I'm FINRA adjacent as a being recently retired. I think the regulators in the US generally do not give great guidance on what to do, right? They don't say, here's a best practice. Stan's doing this at Citadel. You might want to give him a call, right? They say, here's the rule set. You figure out how to comply. We're going to come in and kick the tires and tell us, and you can explain to us what you're doing, and you can explain to us how it's compliant. And we're really interested in doing that. And we're going to hold a conference in, you know, once or twice a year. We're going to have a roundtable about what everybody else is doing, but they don't give you here's the best practice. That's sort of, it's, you know, it's sort of like they wait for the plane to crash and then say, okay, here's where you screwed up. That's the way regulatory worlds work. So that's my reaction to someone like Stan, who will, when we go in, we'll interview him and he'll tell us everything they're doing, and we'll match it up against the rule set. You know, that would be on a routine exam. You know, a lot of these, and I come from a dark place because I really ran most of my career doing fraud investigations, is you've got to have your coverage, but you've also got to have some system in place or techniques to identify holes in your coverage. So in your lexicon, for example, using the AI or other types of technology, what word was just introduced into a conversation in your investment banking department. So if somebody throws out a word like potato chips or being canned, that could be an interesting one-off. So it's complicated for registrants and others to follow the rules because they're 10,000 foot level. And I will say this: the regulators are not expecting perfection. Absolutely not. So I think reasonable systems, techniques with the types of business you're in or what they're looking for. And you should be able to explain that in very sort of common fifth grade language if I was giving advice, because you're going to overwhelming the regulators with technology and tech talk is going to probably go over their heads. That's not to say that FINRA and others aren't tech savvy. They are. But the people who are actually enforcing the regulations are going to need to have explained to them in compliance-oriented language.
That makes sense. I mean, people are people, and I've heard you loud and clear when you say that regulators just want assurance that you're working on risk. Perfection is not necessary. So from your perspective, what opportunities do you see for AI and e-coms to ultimately reduce market risk?
Well, obviously, the more data you have and the better techniques are going to give you better results, right? If you had to hire someone to watch the market all day, think about it that way, which I did early in my career. We would literally watch the market with a very rudimentary computer. It's impossible. So the more technology you can throw over it, and the better data you have, and with governance, I think it's unquestionably going to add value. It's just a question of how do you tune that engine to produce meaningful results. And I think Stan spoke to that. A lot of surveillance systems, they're very sensitive and they produce a lot of noise. So you end up eating up a lot of resources trying to tell yourself that's not important. And more importantly, from an audit standpoint, regulators are going to want to come in and see the results and see what you're doing with your anomalies, right? So that's another area of concern for regulators is what are you producing and how did you resolve it? What's your audit trail to resolve it? And that's not uncommon for anybody on this call, I'm sure. But the better results you have, the less time you spend resolving things that are not meaningful and documenting them and producing them and explaining them to regulators.
Thanks, Cameron. Shlomi, you might be the most smartest person in the room here. A lot of PhDs lying around. So I imagine you have a lot to say about what's being said out there about LLMs and their uses. So in your perspective, is AI, ChatGPT, large language models, are these just buzzwords? How is AI truly reshaping e-com's compliance?
Okay, so definitely not just buzzwords. And I think that the main effect that occurred in the world since ChatGPT was revealed is that now every person can feel for themselves the capabilities of AI. We're talking about large language models. They have evolved over the past few years, and they exist already for, I think, 3 to 4 years in the market. But now, since the emergence of ChatGPT to the general public, everybody knows and feels how good AI solution can be. And it was shocking, I think, all around the world. You all hear the news, you all hear the overall communications and in the newspapers talking about the effects of ChatGPT on the world with different kind of predictions of what will happen with it, but I think that the effect is true and meaningful. The technology is legit. Having said that, and referring to the poll that you just made, we can see that it is not easy for organizations to adopt this technology. You would say it already exists for 6 months, and still most organizations are somewhere in the middle in adopting new and advanced AI. And some of it is related to what Cameron was explaining about the heavily regulated industry and the way that the system are being evaluated and needs to be explained to the regulators on the one hand. And it's hard to make those transitions. But on the other hand, and I truly believe in it, since people are getting used to this technology, it will be something that will be a must-have in any kind of a future solution. Because if you can do it in your own home, if your grandmother can ask something ChatGPT and get an answer, if your kindergarten child and they do already ask something on the cell phone and get the answers for, why can't you do it on your communication data? So from my point of view, I think that definitely this is something that will get a mandatory part on any future solution. I can also refer to a thing that Stan was mentioning regarding the challenges that this industry has, and we are saying that first of all, of course, the volume of electronic communication is just growing with the growth of technology, and the abilities to solve it with the older methodologies is just not available anymore. But again, he was referring to a different challenge. We now, with the ability of new technologies, want to solve a more challenging problems that we have. Why do we have to satisfy with detection of all kinds of compliance issues? We want to also be able to predict them. This is a more sophisticated and more subtle issue to solve, and you need more robust tools to be able to do that. So for solving such challenges, you will definitely need to adopt more sophisticated technologies.
Thanks, Shlomit. Reminding everyone, if you have any questions for Stan, Cameron, Shlomit, or just in general, just hit the QA button below and shoot that question over. Cameron, if it's more than just a buzzword, I'm going to assume that we're going to be hearing more about regulators responding to emerging industry uses of AI and monitoring. And I understand it's not necessarily going to be, and this is what you should do. But like one of the things we hear a lot about is explainability in the models. We want to make sure we can talk to regulators about what we're doing. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think I do think explainability is, an important aspect of communicating with regulators. Like I said, you're going to have, you're going to need to explain, what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how are you, what data governance you have, what data sources you have. I mean, these are all out there. I think you will find that regulators will be skeptical, right? You're a born skeptic when you're a regulator. So when you come in and you start asking questions as a regulator, I think they're going to want to actually see results. And let me just mention something about predictability of compliance issues. That would be amazing if you showed examples of that, because I think what people tend to do is as regulators is they're responsive to a crisis. If you can get ahead of a crisis and report that to a regulator, amazing. Because I always operate that, a problem that exists particularly with a product, or particularly a product that may impact retail investors, is a problem that exists across the industry. So if you can get ahead of it somehow and protect other firms from that problem, and particularly protect investors from that problem, and give the regulators a heads up, absolutely amazing. And I would encourage you to use your techniques, if you can get there, to identify things quickly. Eventually, these problems always emerge because it's a financial industry, right? Money's going to be lost, and ultimately somebody's going to be harmed. So to get ahead of it would be fantastic. So I do think Shlomit raises a good point. If the technology gets to the point where you have some predictability, but I always operate with is you don't know what you don't know, right? And so that's why I say expectations from regulators are not perfection. But if you improve from not being perfect to better, fantastic.
Yeah, I like what you said there about that shift from playing defense to playing offense, if we can take a new approach that allows people to know what's going on in their own organization versus finding out about it from someone external, that's a major shift. Shlomit, implementation concerns are certainly something that we hear from our customers. Can you speak to why implementation is so difficult with these models?
Yes, so one of the first challenges is that we have to several of the newest solutions, ChatGPT included, but also the Google models, is a security issue. Can we send our data over to open APIs? This is a major concern to some of the financial industries. But I think that these issues will be solved. The new models that do not require such APIs will emerge eventually. Or some of them are already out there in the market and are being experimented with. The second main concern, and this is something that Cameron has referred to, is again the explainability. And it is important not only for the regulators, but again, the phrase "you don't know what you don't know" is up to the point here. So I asked, for example, just because the users probably are familiar with it, but I ask ChatGPT and I get an excellent answer. Is it correct? Isn't it correct? What do I know and what don't I know? Models are including a lot of unknown inside of them, and some of the new ones are also are able to actually invent information. So this is something that we should be very careful in using. A small story, I have a son who is working towards his final exams in high school. He was requested to produce a final work paper in history, and his teacher told him, you know, you can use ChatGPT if you want to, but please beware, because if you get any bibliography references, you should double check them in Google. They might be fake. So we are in the world of actually having a great technology, real abilities of doing things that we couldn't do before, but we really need to have in place all of the breaks and balances, as is being said, to make sure that we know what we have, we know what we miss, and we know that what we are producing is actually correct and valid.
Sounds like ChatGPT also picked up on that human trait of fake it till you make it. That is a very interesting example, and exactly, I mean, with all new technologies and with any technology in general, you know, and I think all of you have kind of like hinted to this at one point. The human part of the use of technology. It is a tool to use. It is a supplementary tool. And at some point, what is it doing for you? And how can you prove that value and defend that? Thanks for that story. That's a very good point. Stan, we've all agreed that there are opportunities for AI and surveillance. And Karen mentioned the skepticism necessary as we move forward at breakneck speed. What controls do you see as like key for this forward motion?
Yeah, David, since you kicked off with like a tennis analogy there, I've kind of been thinking how we circle back to that in the spirit of your nicely timed joke there. And going to the question you just asked Shlomit on like, where's the pain coming from? I have a colleague who likes to change his racket every single week, right? He's been doing that for about a decade. His game has not gotten any better. At some point, you got to face the reality that like the answer is it's not so much the problem with the racket or the tooling, it's probably more the player at that point. And I think a lot of the pain points you're hearing is a problem manifests in the firm itself as opposed to a vendor technology. And I think this is really important because like the vendor cannot magically fix the problems that you have internal to your firm. Oftentimes the vendor doesn't even see that until kind of the initial engagement or, you know, later on towards the point of integration. And then teams themselves are kind of flustered and realizing like, oh, wow, how do we fix this when our firm's been around for 50 plus years, right? Or even a decade alone in the last, you know, relative to the advancement of technology in the last decade itself is going to be equivalent to 50 years, right? And so the control aspect really gets to the heart of change management, which I know is like not pleasant to hear because it arises in essentially every facet of organizational operation, right? And like when I look at the way that a lot of these algorithms operate, particularly in the AI space, and you know, with this change management hat on, we saw this case probably in the last couple of weeks where a lawyer is now facing sanctions for using GPT to basically write a motion in court, right? And the citations cited, similar to Shlomi's warning from the professor there, were all made up, right? And some people refer to this as like AI hallucination, right? Where it just kind of made up the references. But I want to be a bit careful with like using more buzzwords because there's a lot of hype in this area, and I want to get down to like what this really is, which is a design problem. So when you think about control, you really should be thinking about design and transparency into that design. And essentially what's going on behind the scenes, like in layman's terms, is that the algorithm probably has some sort of decision path regarding what do I do when I'm not sure, right? And I need to have an answer. And that assumption of need to have an answer itself is already pretty dangerous / important, something that you want to ask about, because what do you do when you're not sure? One answer is give it to the human, right? Which is kind of where you get reinforcement learning or self-supervised machine learning, right? Or semi-supervised machine learning, sorry. And there you essentially have an exception thrown that says, hey, I'm not sure, or here's my confidence interval on this response, which allows a human to dig into. Right now, none of that really exists. The machine just continues to operate, right? And essentially doesn't want to fail over. The other side of the coin is that where the machine continues to operate and you end up getting an answer, right? If you take it for granted, now you can kind of see the types of issues that arise. And from a communication surveillance perspective, none of this is actually new. It's occurred, maybe just a matter of now you're coming to terms with the reality and kind of these hidden risks, so to speak. But some very classic things that happen in reality and in that communication surveillance context is what happens if you get someone with a hyphen in their name when the algorithm thinks that names are just essentially John space Smith, right? Whereas we know people get married or just people have hyphen names as a matter of just, inheritance. Another aspect is what happens when you get two people with the same name, right? Does the algorithm think, wait a minute, I've already processed this before, or is this an update to the first record? So let me just overwrite it. And consequently, now that second person or possibly the first person, depending on the decision path, is no longer supervised, right? And you have a much bigger problem from there. So the really important thing is that you essentially have to study the black box and really focus on this from a change management perspective to understand what is the initial design and what are changes to that design, and look at the testing conducted, right? Specifically unit testing, integration testing. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't like to hear this because 95% of the work is going to be about writing tests, and the other 5% is going to be the fun optimization, but this is the reality that you're in, especially when you're in a very regulated business. One other thing, I think you asked Cameron this question on how do regulators look at this. Let's unpack the word regulator, because it's no longer FINRA SEC. I don't even care if that's the only person you're regulated by. The reality is that the FTC is looking at it, the Department of Labor, pretty much every single state regulator from a data privacy perspective. If your product has any retail-facing arm and utilizes AI, especially like from a insurance, credit, banking perspective, that's going to be in scope. So now you kind of have to study the views of approximately, 100 plus different agencies who are all focused on this. And if one agency is first or more progressive in this regard, even though they're not your regulator, I can guarantee you your regulator is looking at them too, and then you're going to start to get the same question. So it's really paramount to be focusing on this like day by day, because that's the pace of evolution.
That's a really good point, Stan. Thank you. I want to shift the conversation to certain, different elements of the practical approaches that we can take. Cameron, how should firms approach potential conflicts of interest when implementing AI in their surveillance systems?
Yeah, before I answer that, I do have to tell one quick story that Stan made me think of. This is the danger of building these systems. Is we started long time ago. There was message boards out there that were talking about stocks, and the lexicon was, we were trying to figure out. So we said, let's put every symbol into the system and see what pops out, because very concerning about these message boards that were popping up. And we ended up with about 10 million yard sales because one stock was YARD. So the results, so you have to be, that's a good point that Stan makes, is you get, your lexicon has to be careful, because your machines will just, they could produce results that are so overwhelming that they're useless, right? So the hyphen and also with lots of similar names, you get every John Smith in the world. So that's something everybody knows, but I'd like to reinforce it. And I know I found it out painfully, and it's an expensive lesson to learn. In terms of conflict of interest, there's a lot of opportunities, especially in the communications surveillance area. Your data has to be set up depending on the type of firm you have, right? So if you're a full service retail investment banking firm, I mean, you're going to have buckets of people that are going to play different parts of the game. Some of them are going to be regulated differently in the sense of communications because of information barrier and the sharing of information across the barriers, obviously improper. I think there's, investment banking communications. Clearly, you have a lot of material, non-public information that's floating around. I've done probably 40,000 insider trading investigations in my life, and I can assure you that continues to be a very target-rich area for regulators. On the retail side, I've been reading about AI that is, doing suitability analysis and targeting messaging to clients on products that might be suitable for them. Sounds good, except until they're unsuitable, right? And you find that out through a arbitration or a lawsuit. I think that's the conflict there between the data that's being fed and the actual customer has to be, analyzed properly and scoped properly. The other thing that I would just mention is, just as a warning, and I come from a dark place, so I apologize, is 100%, no matter what you're doing, there are people out there, possibly within your own domain, trying to defeat it, right? And that's why I say perfection is not expected, but be aware that the insider threat is real. I mean, people I know always talk about external hacking and things like that, but you have to make sure that you have governance around your policies, procedures, access to prevent insider threats. That is a huge conflict. If I had advanced knowledge of, whatever Citadel's trading big today, I'd probably not be sitting here. I'd be trading. So there are lots of conflicts, obvious ones that people know about when I say it, but then like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. So don't overthink this, right? Don't overthink conflicts. Dumb it down and say, literally, what are some sort of, what would the common person want to steal from us?
Good answer. Thank you, Cameron. Stan, how have you dealt with AI integration? Are there any potential gotchas or challenges that firms should be aware of when they start to integrate AI into their operations?
I don't think it's a gotcha. It's a lot of this is pretty anticipatory from the beginning. So I just previously mentioned, don't blame the racket, blame the player. Focus on yourself, really, to improve your own game. And if you think about this internally, or actually, let's go back to the SEC DERA speech from I think January 2017. So this is years ago, right? Before GPT, where we are today. In that speech, you would think the answer to this question is going to be oh, it's very hard to kind of code these clever algorithms to perform this hypothesis and get our results. The answer is actually much simpler, more surprising. It's if you think about registration filings, they're still on paper. So the answer is we should get this electronic. And then we should probably have a uniform schema for how people provide the registration or corporate filing information. Really simple answer. Kind of goes back to when people look at pyramids, they go, "Wow, that's such a beautiful structure. How did you create that?" 95% of it's laying brick by brick, right, in a very careful, deliberate manner. Pretty mundane work, but very important from a geometrical and otherwise consistent point of view. And this analogy I think applies a lot to firms internally. So in my opinion, the preparation and kind of safekeeping of data in a consistent manner is just 95% of the work, and the remainder 5%, what I call optimization, is the kind of AI answer people typically expect to your question, David. And I think a lot of firms overlook this and rush to vendors looking for explanations on their own data problems. And as I said before, vendors don't have control over that, right? So I give this example. It's pretty simple. Go to HR after this and ask them how many different titles do they have for people in the firm, right? If you have a company with 50 people and you're getting an answer of 100, that's pretty problematic, right? So, and even if you get an answer that you think is relatively okay given the size of your firm, Like tell them you want to analyze the communications or you want to find all the people that are traders, right? And analyze their communications because the regulator is asking you, or you want to do this internal audit exercise. See what they come back with, right? If they come back with like, hey, we have 23 different titles for the same function, like again, that's a problem. And the interesting question to ask you is like, who actually owns that data? Is it HR who's maintaining employee records and doing like maybe some database maintenance? Is it the business who's like hiring these people, maybe determining a role? Is it the person writing the contract? Like who owns that? So at minimum, you probably want transparency on it, because if you're going to use that data either now or down the line, right, and very likely you are going to use it down the line, right, you have to know whether it's in the format you need, because if it's not going to be usable, and vendor's not going to solve that for you, right? Probably at a maximum, you may want to insert yourself into the decision-making process for kind of how information like this gets decided, but doing so in a commercial way is also pretty difficult, right? One other thing, like I guess more of a story from the roads traveled, is it's really important to map out like dependencies or sub-vendors, so to speak. So right now we've just kind of been using the word vendor, I think, for granted. When a communication surveillance vendor comes in, they're going to be surveilling messages like Bloomberg, right? That's a whole separate vendor, or so to speak, a sub-vendor, right? And similarly for iPhone messages, WhatsApp, like each of these carry their own respective data policies and attributes. So this then creates multiple points of failure. One, it could be the organization. Two, it could be the surveillance vendor who's ingesting all this and doing analytics. Three, it could actually be the underlying sub-vendor here. So the most important thing is, or if I leave you with two words from this entire question, it's data provenance, which is understanding like, where's this information coming from? How does it travel? Who's every single person that touches it? Where did it change? And then if it changed, especially to a way that's now incorrect, how are you alerted? When are you alerted, right? I kind of hate to like give 15 questions in response to a question, but this is the reality. And welcome to having to build a pyramid.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Stan. I mean, we talked about how, like, I think Cameron said, like, you don't know what you don't know, but you definitely don't know what you don't have and can't make sense of. That's a non-starter. Shlomit, with all we've covered so far, I know this is enough to keep us all busy, but I'm curious, any thoughts on AI in terms of like, where is it going to help us? What's it going to help us do next?
Okay, so maybe we can start with even keeping us up in the same level as we used to be a year ago. 2 years ago, we will need to use more advanced technology. As mentioned first, the volumes of electronic communications is constantly growing. So we have to have in place more accurate systems. We cannot constantly increase the amount of people that are reviewing the false alerts all around. Second thing is that, and Cameron mentioned that, we are dealing with people who are trying to, eventually the ones that we're trying to catch are trying to manipulate the system. So let's say that you have in place a kind of a lexicon solution. You put something in place, for example, all kinds of phrases, don't text me, don't WhatsApp me, or anything like that. It will take 1 month, 2 months. The surveilled employees will be familiar with those phrases. They will vanish from communications. Will this behavior stop occurring? No, but they will make sure that you cannot monitor it in the exact same way that you used to before. That's why our solutions need to be growing solutions that are subtle to, and this is the great advantage of large language models, subtle to nuances in languages that are able to detect different phrasings of the same idea or the same notion or the same action that is being taken place, and do not allow for humans to quickly cheat the system. So I think that as a first ground rule, even to stay in the same place that we are today, being able to detect the same risks, we will need more advanced technologies. In terms of the future of AI, I think that what's happening in the world today is really a revolution. And the main thing that happened since I think the multiple use of ChatGPT is that people are getting more and more used to being able to use free language to question complicated systems. So if I am a compliance officer, I don't want anymore to collect set of rules or set of lexicons or connect to different databases on my own or set different queries just to be able to get information. I want to present the question in a human manner and to be able, we call it, chat with my own data in a free text language. And I think that the technology is going to enable us to do that in the very near future, if not even today. This is one thing that is definitely going to change, because people can feel that they can do it and the technology allows it, and it makes life so much easier for everybody. The second thing that I think the next generation is, again, for models to evolve, and this is already happening, to be able to do more than just answering questions, to connect different tools and systems. So if Stan was saying, I need to put in place a sophisticated system to detect the vendor, the data source type, the HR data, and everything, instead of having manual work to do to put in place there, the different models that are doing different tasks will be able to talk one with another. So I will be able to chat in a free text, but also get something to create a sophisticated query or a sophisticated rule for me and collect the data in a manner that I need it eventually to occur to me. So to sum up, we're facing real exciting times, a real exciting future, and it's, from my point of view, great times to be in.
Very cool. You're in the front row seat to all this, so I mean, that's really cool.
I have a question for Shalomit. How do you deal with people who are using emojis or pictures or something that's not language? Is that a way to, is there a way to surveil for that, and is it meaningful?
Oh, definitely. So emojis are part of our language. The fact that I would say old-fashioned solutions are treating words as a trigger. It's just one manner of looking at the data. The more advanced models will look definitely on emojis, and we are doing it ourselves as well, of course. But on all kinds of data sources, if we have pictures included, if we have voice included, if we have all kinds of hints and layers and types of information added to any kind of communication, they should be analyzed with a way that, with a model that knows these kinds of input data. So yes, and this is becoming more and more important because we are all from one generation, but when I see the younger generation, they are not talking in words anymore. They are talking in pictures, they are talking with emojis, they are talking with a lot of other symbols that are different than what we used to do. And it definitely needs to be incorporated in our solution, in any kind of solution.
Very cool. Cameron, we got a question here from the audience. How can firms ensure AI and LLMs are used ethically in compliance and surveillance?
Oh, that's such a great question. That's a really great question. The answer is, I don't know exactly how that could be formulated, but you have to think about it from a practical standpoint, and it would obviously be an important aspect of your employee agreement that you would act ethically and only in the business interest usages, right? But if you think about it, right, let's use Stan's example of the SEC did some lexicon search or saw some trend in filings that credit default swaps were mentioned. So let's say in your own world of communications, you had access to a trend in a product or a target or some sort of investment, and one of your employees leak that information to somebody, right? That would clearly be something that would be unethical, right? But I don't think people really think about it that way, because in the modern or the less modern world is, ethics is, it when you see it. And so I would think you would want to sit in a room, and you're never going to cover anything, but to come up with practical, ethical guidance that doesn't, it's like the regulators say, we know it when we see it. I think you want to think about your business, what the vulnerabilities are in terms of opportunities for employees to extrapolate information and use it improperly, and train them. I mean, you cannot overtrain people, and there's enough real world examples of misfires, cases brought by the SEC, FINRA, and use those to train people and say, and I do think the regulators are impressed when you have have a training cycle, document what you're talking about, and it's relevant, not just the stale, sort of bring in some guest speaker who's talking about stuff that happened 3 years ago, 5 years ago. And this stuff is very rapidly changing. So from an ethics standpoint, it's a really good thought-provoking question that everybody should be thinking about. And the other thing, that always comes to mind for me is people who are leaving your firm, right? What are their ethical obligations? What should you be looking at for? I mean, you have this concept of bad leavers, right? People who are leaving for whatever reason, and they're going to cause chaos, right? So, that clearly is unethical, and you've got to put things in place to monitor people who are leaving. Not everybody who's leaving is happy, right? Happy with you. So be careful of bad leavers.
Those are some really good examples and some good ideas. Thank you. Stan, I got a question for you here. What strategies can employers use, I think, to upskill current employees to work with AI?
There's a lot of free resources like on EDX, Coursera, on the topic, quite frankly. Like literally, super simple answer. Google it and look for introductory courses to this just to understand how it's being utilized, understand like where it came from. Like this stuff is not all groundbreaking to you in the regard of like you're in an entirely isolated place. So just understanding the history and will help you get grounding, and then beginning to understand the context that all this technology works in will be key. Like this isn't one of those like immediately go sign up for Python courses, start coding tomorrow. Like this is not what you should be rushing to. Like take it carefully, but there's a lot of free resources, just understanding how all of this comes to fruition, how it's architected, the risks associated with the activity, right? And I think it's really important to like, don't have your head in the sand on this. Like you essentially have constructive notice right now that a lot of firms are experimenting with this. And as I said before, pretty sure everyone and their family members have been talking to this just as a chatbot itself. So the more that you essentially come to grips with evolving tech, emerging tech, and interact with it yourself, you will start to see faults, weaknesses, advantages of it, which will help give you really good context when you speak to business on it. But I really do strongly encourage taking some introductory classes, which again are free, and kind of using that to reform your firm training, because people will find that to be a more interesting approach to training as well, rather than having off-the-shelf material, especially developed by some other vendor. Like I give this analogy of like, if you're in the financial industry and your training presentation has a character with like a construction hat on, right? That training is probably not well suited for the activity that you're engaged in, right?
Thank you, Stan. Yeah, good to make sure that whatever we are learning actually seems like it's directed at us and makes sense for what we're trying to do. Last question, just we're getting towards time here. Shlomit, what advice do you have for firms that are skeptical of integrating AI?
This is a good question, and there are a lot of firms that are skeptical. I tend to say from an AI perspective, eventually the proof is in the pudding. Results are the measurements that you need to make sure that are good for you. And a second thing and a second suggestion is to request and ask for all formats of explanatory models and model governance and bias evaluation of the models to make you more confident in your ability to use it. But again, I think that it is already common knowledge that AI can do better. For those companies who are hesitant, just ask to test it and see if results are really better for you. And I'm sure that if the solution is implemented correctly, you will find out that this is the case.
That's a good answer. I mean, it's certainly being used in so many use cases. I think, Shlomi, you've actually mentioned to me a number of times how, like, every time if you go into like a country, right, with passport control, there's an AI that's scanning your face, and they're actually, depending on the country and setup, but like they're actually relying on this fully almost. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely what to be skeptical about, but also let's see the use cases. So I think that's great.
Every skeptical person is looking at their phone and expecting it to happen just from recognizing himself. So think about that the next time that you say no to AI.
That's a good point. Thank you.
David, if I could also add to Shlomi's answer there, going back to the previous question you just asked, like the mention of the word framework is really important, because like the Federal Reserve just published like updated commentary on like model risk management, right? And there's a lot of frameworks that are available that look at AI and how to think about AI and change management, technology governance in general, that are really, really effective training material for any firm. And again, they're written in a way that anyone should be able to pick this up and understand and go along. So I highly encourage looking at it from that perspective. I'm pretty sure FINRA is also published on this too.
Yeah, thank you, Stan. I want to wrap up with a short anecdote. So I was thinking about this earlier in the week. So imagine you're running to catch a train and just barely missed it. You're like, frustrated or sweating, losing your breath. I just missed my train and I ran this whole way just to try to get it. So you wait for the next one and finally it arrives. Except it's not a train. It's a hypersonic vehicle that takes you home in half the time. Now, that sounds nuts, but that's basically what's happening right now with AI and compliance, and actually really any industry. Just what you can do changes every time you look at the news again. And I mean, if you're really paying close attention, every day there's just new companies popping up with whole new use cases, and a lot of them are really good. So the question isn't just about what's the best model or tool to use now, but more like, how can we position ourselves to adapt and leverage the next wave of technological advances? This level of opportunity is a fundamental part of why our guests today and many others are focusing on AI, and particularly ChatGPT and LLMs. Thank you to our panelists, Stan, Cameron, Shlomit. Your insights provide us with a real, I think, just nuanced understanding of how AI and especially ChatGPT and large language models are reshaping the world of financial e-commerce compliance and how you can effectively leverage them to control risk. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope that this discussion has challenged your thinking and sparked curiosity. As the conversations around AI and compliance continues to evolve, we invite you to stay engaged, ask questions, and continue learning. Now, just a quick word about Shield. The Shield platform is built with a modern architecture designed to deliver actionable insights about risk to stakeholders throughout your organization. It's engineered to adapt to the fast pace of technology, ensuring you're always ahead of the curve. We invite you to learn more by visiting our website, reaching out to our team of experts. In closing, the rise of AI in financial services e-commerce compliance is an exciting journey, and one that we're pretty thrilled to be a part of with all of you. We hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you all, and have a great day.